branded by her own husband like cattle. A cowboy burned the mark off and gave her dignity. The iron was still in the fire when I found her. Not that fire, that was 6 weeks gone by then, and the man who'd held the iron was in the ground outside Cutter's Bluff with a plank marker that wouldn't last the first hard winter. I mean the fire in the stove of that half-collapsed line, shack at the edge of the Driscoll pasture. The one everybody in the valley knew about, and nobody rode past any more out of some unspoken agreement to pretend it wasn't there. I found her because my horse threw a shoe 2 miles short, and I had to walk him in. And the only structure between me and another 4 miles of open plain in an October wind that had teeth in it was that shack. I knocked. Not many men knock on a derelict line shack door. I did. She opened it maybe 3 inches. One eye, brown and still as creek water before a storm, looked at me through the gap. The other side of the door I couldn't see, but I heard something shift, weight moving quiet and deliberate, a rifle being repositioned. I said I needed to get my horse out of the wind, and could I use the lean-to around back. She said nothing for long enough that I started to think she wouldn't answer at all. Then she said, "The lean-to's got a loose board on the west side. I'll patch it come spring, but I haven't yet." I said that was fine and thanked her and took my horse around. That was the first time I saw Nora Calloway. Or Nora Vance, which is what her name had been before Dale Vance put a ring on her finger and then a brand on her shoulder, and which is what she went back to after they put him in the ground. I didn't know any of that then. I didn't know her name. I just knew there was a woman alone in a broken-down shack and whether that was starting to mean it. And she had a rifle positioned to cover the door. And she'd patched the stove herself with river clay dried hard as brick. And she'd stacked enough wood to last 2 months against the interior wall because she either couldn't trust the lean-to or couldn't trust the distance between herself and the wood at night. A person who stacks their wood inside knows something about being afraid. I got the horse settled. The loose board was exactly where she'd said. I propped it with a stone I found under the snow at the corner, and when I came back around to the front, I knocked again. I said, "I'm going to make it to Harlan's Crossing before full dark if I move now, but if you need anything brought out when I come back through." She opened the door all the way that time. She was younger than the situation had made her seem. 30, maybe a little past. Dark hair pulled back with a piece of twine. A face that had been pretty before it got weathered and careful, and was still pretty, but in the way stone outcroppings are pretty, a beauty that had made its terms with hard weather and wasn't offering anything more than that. She was wearing her coat inside, which meant the stove wasn't keeping up with the cold the way she needed it to. She said, "Who are you?" I told her, "My name is Gideon Cross. I ran the Alderman freight contract out of Cutter's Bluff," which was the truth then, though I didn't know yet that the contract was 3 weeks from being canceled on account of aldermen selling to a railroad concern out of Denver who had their own supply chain and didn't need an old man with 2 mules and a wagon. I'd been riding out to the eastern pastures to look at a remuda sale a man named Burkett was putting on, hoping to pick up a horse or 2 I could work into a string. The thrown shoe had shortened that trip considerably. She looked at me for a while, not hostile exactly. More like a woman reading weather, trying to determine what kind of storm this was, and whether she had enough in the shack to outlast it. She said, "I don't need anything from town." I said, "All right." She said, "But the stove. There's a crack in the flue pipe where it goes through the roof. I packed it with clay, but the draw's not right and it smokes back sometimes, if you know stoves." I said I knew stoves some. I went up on the roof in that wind and looked at what she'd done, and it was actually a fair patch job. The clay was good and she'd pressed it in deep, but the pipe had shifted at the joint below where it exited, and that was where the draw was breaking. I came back down and told her, and she handed me a piece of bent tin and some wire without being asked, which meant she'd already diagnosed it and just couldn't get the angle from inside. Took me 20 minutes. When I came in and got warm, she had coffee on. She didn't say thank you exactly. She poured 2 cups and set one on the table near the chair she'd pointed me to, and that was the thanks. I understood it perfectly. I didn't make it to Harlan's Crossing that night, stayed in the lean-to with my horse. She'd put an extra blanket over the half-door before dark without me asking, just came around the corner, set it on the rail, and went back inside. The blanket smelled like cedar and something else, a dried herb I couldn't name. Probably she'd tucked it in her things when she left wherever she'd come from and carried it here. In the morning, I left. I thought about her twice on the ride home, not in any particular way. Just the kind of thinking you do when something you've seen doesn't settle easy. What I found out about Dale Vance, I found out the way you find out most things in a place like Cutter's Bluff. Not from one person telling you, but from 6 different people each telling you a piece they figured you already knew, until you'd assembled the whole ugly shape of it. Vance had been a freighter, too, before he sold his rig and started day-drinking full-time sometime around the 3rd year of a drought that broke everyone in the valley at least a little. He'd married Nora when she was 22, brought her out from Wichita, and whatever she'd thought she was coming to had not been what she found. He was the kind of man whose pleasant company at a card game and something else entirely behind a closed door. Not the kind of man who hits, or not only. The kind who finds more particular ways to make plain that you belong to him. The brand, from what the blacksmith and he's told me without knowing he was telling me anything significant, just working it into a conversation about livestock marking, the way men will, happened the winter before last. He'd heated up a small iron he'd had made, a V with a line through it, his mark on his horses, and he'd used it on her. Tull said it like it was a thing he'd heard and wasn't sure he believed, and had basically decided not to think about further. Like too many men in that valley had basically decided the same. She'd gone away in the spring when he went to Harlan's Crossing for 2 days on business. Took the mule that was technically hers, took what she could carry, rode to the line shack at the edge of the Driscoll pasture, which nobody was using since Driscoll himself had died the year before and his sons back east hadn't decided yet what to do with the land. She'd been there 6 weeks when I knocked. Vance had come after her once, that's why the rifle. He'd gone back to Cutter's Bluff and fallen off a horse at a bad angle 2 weeks later and been dead by morning. He'd been drunk. The horse had been startled by a dog, that's all it was. But the valley had not forgotten, and the valley had not forgiven. Not her, I mean. The valley had not forgiven her for being the woman the thing had happened to. That's its own kind of evil, the way people need someone to have caused the bad thing, and the person the bad thing happened to is always right there and already marked. Easier to cross to the other side of the street than to carry the weight of knowing you did nothing. She'd stayed in the shack because she had nowhere to go to that wasn't worse. I rode back out there 10 days after the first visit. My horse was reshod, and I didn't have a reason that held up to scrutiny, but I rode out anyway. I brought flour, dried beans, a length of stove pipe that would replace the cracked section properly, and a jar of my Aunt Petra's pickled peppers, because I'd had them sitting in my saddlebag from a week ago, and they'd survived the ride and they were good. I knocked. 3 inches, brown eye, the rifle sound. I said, brought a new section of pipe, and some supplies if you want them. You can tell me to go to hell if you don't. She opened the door. She looked at the saddlebags. She looked at my face. She said the peppers. I said they were from my Aunt Petra, who put up about 60 jars every fall and gave them to anyone who came by, because she couldn't eat them all herself and didn't see the point of things going to waste. She took the jar, held it in both hands, and looked at it like it was something she hadn't seen in a while, a thing given without a cost attached. She said, come in then. I started riding out there once a week, then twice. I told myself it was because she needed the supplies and I was passing through anyway on my remuda errands, which had expanded from one Burkett sale into a genuine small enterprise now that the alderman contract had indeed collapsed and I'd needed something to replace it. I was picking up horses here and there, breaking them to a standard, selling them to outfits further west. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The truth was I rode out there because she was the most interesting person in a 50-mile radius, and I was 61 years old, and I'd been alone for 11 years, and there's a particular kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. We talked, that first, just talked. She was not a woman who warmed fast or easy, but she was a woman who, once she decided to speak, spoke plainly and without decoration. She'd grown up in Wichita, father a clerk at a dry goods house, mother who'd taken in mending. She'd had 1 year of proper schooling before they needed her to help at home. She'd read everything she could get her hands on since she was 8 years old. She'd thought at 22 that marrying a man with land and a business meant something about the kind of life she'd have. She talked about Dale Vance exactly once to me. The one time in full, I listened and I didn't say a word, and when she was finished I said, he's dead. She said, I know, I said. Then we don't have to discuss him again unless you want to. She said, I don't want to. We never discussed him again. The shoulder, I didn't see it for a long while. Didn't ask. She wore her coat, and then when it got warmer, she wore a shirt with a high neck, and I understood the architecture of it. A woman building walls around the thing she didn't want seen. I wasn't going to knock on that wall. November came, and the shack was too cold. The Driscoll sons had written to say they'd be putting the property up for sale in the spring, and she was technically trespassing, which she knew, and hadn't figured out what to do about yet. I had by then rented a small house at the south edge of Cutter's Bluff. 2 rooms, a proper stove, a barn for 4 horses. I was making enough to hold it, not enough to hold much else. I rode out there on a Wednesday in the first week of November, and the temperature had dropped hard the night before, and I could see from 50 yards that the stovepipe smoke wasn't right, too thin, stopping and starting. Inside, the stove had gone cold. She had every blanket she owned piled on the cot and was sitting in them with her coat on, and her breath was making fog in the air. She was reading. She'd been reading rather than acknowledge that she was in trouble, which was one of the most particular things about Nora Vance. She would not show trouble to anyone, not even to herself, if she could avoid it. I didn't say anything about the cold or the stove. I got the stove going again. The problem was a bird's nest in the chimney cap. Took me 20 minutes. And when it was drawing right, I stood there while the room started to warm and said what I'd been thinking about for 2 weeks. I said, I've got a house in town, 2 rooms, you can have one. I'll sleep in the barn if that makes it easier. No conditions, no claim on you, but you can't stay out here in December. She looked at me over the top of her book. She'd heard the book drop to her lap without looking, and that meant she was taking it seriously. She said, what do you want for it? I said, nothing. She said, men don't do things for nothing. I said, I'm not doing it for nothing. I'm doing it because you'll freeze, and because I'd like someone in the house who's worth talking to, and because I can. She was quiet long enough that I thought she was going to say no. Then she said, I'll cook. Not as payment. I'll cook because I like to cook, and 2 people eating takes the same fire as 1. I said that was fine. She said, and I'll pay half the rent when I've gotten work. I'll find work. I said that was fine too. She said, and if I want to leave, I leave. I said, I'll help you pack. She looked at me another long moment. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, more like a knot in a rope coming loose, just the one knot out of several. She said, all right. What happened in Cutter's Bluff in the first 2 weeks after I brought Nora Vance into town was more or less what I'd expected. Which is to say, it was ugly in the way small places are ugly when they've got someone to be ugly at. Mabel Trent, who ran the dry goods store and knew about the brand because her husband did business with Ennis Tull, and Tull couldn't keep a thing to himself, told 3 people within the first 4 days. The result of that particular pebble dropping in a particular pond was that Nora could not walk down the main street without a gap opening in front of her. Not dramatic, not cruel in any obvious way. Just the quiet practice thing of people finding reasons to be looking elsewhere. A man named Holly's Pryor, who'd been a second-tier nuisance in the valley for as long as anyone remembered, said something to Nora outside the post office that I didn't hear and she didn't repeat. I found out about it second-hand from the postmaster, who had heard it and had the decency to be ashamed he hadn't said anything. I went to find Pryor. He was at the feed store, leaning on a post, working a toothpick. He was the kind of man who's always leaning on something. I said, you said something to the woman staying in my house. You're not going to do that again. He looked me over the way men like him look men over, measuring, deciding what they can get away with. I'm not a large man. I was 61 and running light and weathered, and my right knee had been giving me trouble for 2 years. But I have spent my entire life in places where things go wrong fast, and I learned a long time ago that the thing most men respond to is not size. It's certainty. Whether you're going to be trouble and how much. He decided I was. He said, she a relation of yours? I said no. He said, then what is she to you? I said, she's a woman who's under my roof and my protection, and that's a thing I take serious. The same way I'd take it serious about any person under my roof. He chewed his toothpick. He said, she's a branded woman, Cross. I said, she's a woman who was tortured by her husband and then outlasted him. That's what she is. He left the toothpick in the side of his mouth and looked at me and looked away first, which was what I'd needed. I didn't go looking for trouble with anyone else. I didn't have to. That conversation at the feed store is the kind of thing that gets repeated, and in a small town, the repeated thing is the thing that sets the water level. Within 2 weeks, the open gap on the street had closed. Not everyone was warm, not everyone was ever going to be warm, but no one was doing the calculated, ugly thing anymore either. Nora had found work by then anyway. She'd gone to see a woman named Frances Aldgate who ran a small lending library out of her house, the only library within 40 miles, 2 rooms of books that the town had been building since 1867, and Frances had hired her to catalog and repair the collection, which had been deteriorating for 10 years without anyone paying proper attention to it. Nora worked there 4 days a week, and it suited her like a shirt suits someone who's been cold a long time. She didn't talk about the library the way people talk about work. She talked about it the way people talk about the thing they were made to do that they almost didn't get to. I saw the brand for the first time in January. She'd been hanging laundry in the barn when I came in out of the cold, and she'd had her coat off for the work, and her shirt had shifted at the shoulder. It was there for maybe 3 seconds before she adjusted the shirt. A V with a line through it, burned into the skin above the right shoulder blade. Old enough now that it had scarred over, silver pink against her skin, but clear as a brand on a calf's hip. The shape of it clean and deliberate, which was somehow worse than if it had been jagged. She'd gone still when she felt me behind her, her back to me, her shirt back in place. I said nothing for a moment, then I said, "I'm sorry that was done to you." She said, "It's there." I said, "I know." She said, "I can't make it not be there." I said, "I know that too." She turned around then. Her face had gone to stone, the way it did when she was bracing. She was waiting for the disgust or the pity or the calculation, whichever flavor it was going to be. I said, "Do you want it gone?" She said, "What?" I said, "There are things that can be done, not to make it disappear entirely, but to change what it looks like. A good burn on top of it, done right, can turn a brand into a scar that doesn't read as a brand anymore. Looks like a burn from a fire from a cook stove. I've seen it done." She stared at me. I don't think she'd ever been offered that. I don't think it had occurred to her that it was on offer. She said, "Who would do that?" I said, "I would. I've worked cattle since I was 14. I know how to handle iron. And I'd go careful and slow, and I'd stop if you needed me to stop. But I understand if you'd rather have nothing to do with fire near that spot again." She looked at me for a long time. The barn was quiet except for the horses and the wind under the eave boards. She said, "You'd do it wrong on purpose, make it look like an accident." I said, "I'd make it look like what it should have been. A scar from living, not a mark from owning." She was quiet, then she said, "Let me think on it." She thought on it for 2 weeks. Then one morning in February, a Sunday, when the house was warm from the stove and there was no one around for a long way in any direction, she came into the main room and said, "All right." I won't describe the doing of it at length. It was careful and it was slow, and I stopped twice because she needed me to stop, and each time I stopped I waited without talking until she was ready again. She didn't cry, which wasn't toughness, exactly. It was more that she'd used up whatever reserve had been attached to that particular pain already, in the year she'd spent carrying it. By the end, she was sitting with her shirt off her shoulder and her eyes fixed on the middle distance and her breathing even. When it was done, I put clean cloth against it and tied it off, and that was that. She sat there for a while, then she said, "What does it look like?" I said, "Like you fell against a stove, which is nobody's business but yours to explain or not." She reached back with her left hand and put it over the clean cloth, feeling the shape under the bandage. Her hand stayed there, not pressing hard, just resting. She said, "Gideon." I said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." I said, "You don't have to thank me." She said, "I know I don't have to." Spring came and the Driscoll sons sent a man out from back east to assess the property, which got sold to a sheep operation out of Wyoming in April. None of that mattered to us by then. Nora had been in my house for 5 months. She'd made it into something I hadn't known it could be, not domesticated, exactly, which sounds like a lesser thing than what I mean. More like she organized a space around herself the way a good camp cook organizes a cookfire, with precision and purpose and nothing wasted and everything in the right place. The house smelled different, better, like something was being tended. We ate together every evening. She'd commandeered a shelf above the stove and filled it with jars, dried herbs, pickled things, seeds in paper twists. She grew lavender in a tin on the windowsill that had no business surviving the altitude, but did anyway because she spoke to it with some regularity. She finished cataloging the Aldgate Library in March, and Francis had started paying her a little more and talking to people about her in ways that made a difference. I was doing all right with the horses. Not rich, I was never going to be rich, and I had no specific interest in it, but solid. A man with a business and a house and his debt current and his horses healthy, which is, in the long measure, a kind of wealth. One evening in April, a Tuesday, we were sitting after dinner on the 2 chairs outside the front of the house. It was the first real warm evening of the year, and we dragged the chairs out, and she said, without any particular preamble, "I want to tell you something." I said, "All right." She said, "When you came out to the shack the second time, with the pipe section and the flour and the peppers from your aunt." I said, "I remember." She said, "I decided before you knocked that if you were coming out there for what men usually come to a woman alone for, I was going to shoot you. I had the rifle right there. I had it thought through." I said, "That was sensible." She said, "But you knocked, and you stood back from the door, you didn't push." I said, "I've knocked on enough doors in my life to know what it means when someone doesn't open them all the way." She was quiet for a while. Down the street, a dog was barking at nothing in particular. She said, "I've been thinking about what you are." I said, "What kind of thinking?" She said, "The kind where I try to decide what the catch is." I said, "And?" She said, "I can't find one, and that worries me more than a catch would." I said, "What would it take to stop worrying you?" She turned and looked at me, the way she looked when she was going to say a true thing. She said, "Time, mostly, and you staying the same as you've been." I said, "I can do that." She said, "I know, that's the part that worries me." I laughed, which surprised me. It surprised her too. Her mouth did the thing it sometimes did, where it was deciding whether to smile. I said, "Nora." She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm 61 years old. I've done a fair number of things in my life I'm not proud of. I've cut corners when it suited me, and I've been harder than necessary, and I once left a town in a considerable hurry over a matter I won't go into. I'm not a good man in the way of a man who's never been tempted to be otherwise." She said, "I know." I said, "But I've never once in my life put my hand on a woman except in kindness. And I never will. And you staying in this house, having you here, it's the best thing that's happened to me in more years than I can count. You don't owe me anything for it. You don't owe me." She looked at me for a long time. Then she got up and moved her chair so it was alongside mine, close, the way you'd put a chair to sit with someone at the end of a long day. She sat back down. She didn't say anything more. She didn't have to. After a while, she put her hand on my forearm and left it there. The hand that had covered the bandage back in February, easy and unhurried like it belonged. We sat there until dark, the 2 of us in the first warm air of spring. And down the street the dog had found whatever it was looking for and gone quiet, and the valley was very still. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I'm done. In June, the man named Holly's Pryor, the one from the feed store, the toothpick, had occasion to do business with a buyer I'd been working with, a man named Carver who ran a good-sized operation 40 miles west and bought horses from me regular. Pryor was trying to sell Carver a piece of land adjacent to his pasture, and it wasn't going well because Pryor's reputation for corner cutting had preceded him. Carver told me about this conversation later. Pryor had apparently mentioned me in the context of Carver knowing me, trying to suggest some kind of shared connection. And Carver had said, "You know Cross." And Pryor, from what Carver told me, had looked at his boots and said, "I know of him." Carver said, "Good man." Pryor said, "Straight as they come." Now I don't put much stock in reputation. Reputation's a thing other people carry for you, and they drop it when it gets heavy. What I put stock in is the actual doing of a thing, the actual day-to-day of whether you are what you say you are. But I won't lie to you. I won't pretend I didn't feel something when Carver told me that. I'm 61 years old. I've been called a lot of things in a lot of towns, some of them deserved. Straight as they come. I went home that evening, and it was home by then. The word fit the way a worn boot fits. No argument left in it. And Nora was at the stove, and the house smelled like the thing she made with dried chilies and late-season venison that had become, without ceremony, one of my favorite things in the world. She heard me come in and didn't turn from the stove right away. She said, "Carver send payment." I said he did. She said, "Good. I need oil for the lamp and a new card for the wool I got from Francis." I sat down at the table. I said, "Nora." She turned then, one hand still on the pot, and looked at me. She had flour on her forearm, and her hair was loose from the pin that had been holding it, and her eyes were clear and direct, the way they'd always been, from the first 3 inches of that door to now. Brown and still, taking the measure of things. I said, "I'm glad you didn't shoot me." She looked at me. The corner of her mouth moved. She said, "I'm glad you knocked." She turned back to the stove. I sat there at that table in that house that smelled like hers now, in that town that had mostly come around to seeing her the way I'd always seen her. And I was 61 years old and rougher than most good things deserve. And I had a woman in my kitchen who'd survived the unsurvivable and come out of it with her spine intact, and her eyes honest, and her hand easy on my arm in the first warm dark of spring. I've been called a lot of things. Straight as they come. I'll take that, I'll take all of it.